Right. Okay. So, first of all, I think we look back and have a few moments just for questions. Over the last few days, we've looked at various aspects. We read the story of the raising of Lazarus, and on that occasion, that was two sessions, I think, ago. On that occasion, we all shared something about what stood out for us and talked about it. And we covered a lot of ground, but perhaps not everything was said that could have been said. And then we followed that up last week by thinking about the crowd as they reacted to the situation. So all of that's from chapter 11, and we worked through that. I think we did talk fairly well about that. And I'm just looking at the last part of verse 11. Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. That's northeast of Jerusalem, just a few miles. And then when it was time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country, that probably refers to Galilee, to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. I've been trying to find out, what's this ceremonial cleansing? Now, at the beginning of the Passover, you'll remember that there was the custom to sweep the house and search the house for any sign of leaven and get rid of every sign of leaven, no matter how small it might be. It all had to go, and that was continued on, and I think still today Jews still do that. But that's to do with cleaning the house. Now they wash their hands as part of the process, but I'm not aware of anything else. Anybody got any knowledge of anything extra that they needed to do? Ambrose is shaking his head. Okay, you'll remember that when Jesus said he was going to Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, his disciples said, "Whoa, it's a bit dangerous. Not long ago, they were trying to kill you." And Jesus said he had to go to wake up Lazarus. And it was Thomas who says, "Let's all go that we might die with him." So they were not expecting a comfortable time. And the last verse of chapter 11 says, "The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him." So there was a warrant out for his arrest, and they were looking for him. So we go into chapter 12, and at the beginning of chapter 12, we have the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus at the home, and Jesus being there. And Jesus was the honored guest. It was obviously either a meal to give thanks for what he had done or whatever. We don't know how soon after this is from what we've read in the chapter before. We do know it's 6 days before the Passover, but we don't know if it's a few days after Jesus had raised Lazarus. I suspect it possibly was just a few days. And last week, I think we looked at that, and we looked at the anointing of the feet of Jesus with the costly ointment by Mary, and Martha cooking the meal and making everything ready, and Lazarus being there, witnessing to the fact that he was alive again. And again, we have very angry Pharisees and so on looking for Jesus. Now, do you think we've thoroughly dealt with the beginning of chapter 12, or does anybody want to go back or ask a question about any of it? Just looking at chapter 12 and the first 11 verses. We did talk about how costly the ointment was, didn't we? And talked about what we do by worship. What do we mean by worshiping Jesus? And going to church and singing 4 hymns and listening to a couple of Bible readings and a sermon doesn't sort of equate with a whole year's money given in one go, poured out upon the feet of Jesus.
I was wondering when when Notre Dame was reopened at the weekend.
Yeah.
I was wondering what our reaction should be to the amount of money it cost. Because it was, I mean, an incredible gift to God on one hand. And on the other hand, it could be seen as an incredible waste of money.
So much the same as the controversy with Mary then.
Yes.
And I suppose coming from, you know, a church building which is very, very stark in many ways, I'm a bit more conflicted. I mean, I'm pleased on one hand that they've done it and that it looks so beautiful. And I understand its importance to the nation of France. But on the other hand, I think it's unforgivable that people are in such incredible need and all this money has been spent on that fabric, you know, the whole of the building.
Yes.
And I don't know really, you know, how I should feel about it.
I kind of guess that we have the same reflection over everything that we do. I just conscious that Sundays in almost every church in the UK, a collection is taken up or an offering is given, and people give. Some people tithe to their church and so on. But it's not used much for mission or spreading the gospel, and it's just really spending money on ourselves, on the environment in which we worship, and but it's difficult. I don't know whether the Catholic Church paid for it or whether they raised money in France for it. Do you know, Dorothy?
I don't. I mean, I think quite a bit of it was from the state. I think it's one of the few things that the state would actually give money to, because of course it's a very secular state, but I think it's seen as you know, this representative of France.
Yes.
Sorry. I stood in it 9 years ago before it got burned down, and it was the most wonderful feeling. I felt the whole thing. It just brought, you know, that you were there, and it was something wonderful. And you know, and I nearly cried when it got burnt down, because I thought of all the people missing that wonderful just feeling it was, and the beautiful pictures and the windows, and it all shines in as like a big dome. And
it would have been
it was wonderful.
It would have been a challenge to the insurance company, I'm sure. Right.
Okay. I mean, I think we're only human beings, aren't we? We're only human. We're only finite beings, and we try to do things to the glory of God. And I remember talking to the vicar of Oldham once, and he described the parish church as a sacrament in stone, and I think it's really important that we cherish and value our church buildings, because every one that closes and every one that we lose is a step backwards. It's not. I don't see it as a step forwards. It means the congregation is no longer there, and that people of faith are no longer gathering in that building. And it is really, the church buildings are really important, and we should be, you know, in my mind, we should be. I'm very clear about that, about what we're spending our money on. But I manage the building. I manage my chapel. I've managed it for nearly 20 years, and a lot of money, relatively speaking, has been spent. And I get people coming into the chapel, and they'll preach a sermon and say, "Oh, it's not the building. It's just the people."
Yeah.
But these are the same people that want to use our building.
Yes.
And I say to them, "Yeah, you come and preach that. You haven't got a building of your own, but you want to use everybody else's." And then people might have the same sentiment. They soon complain when there's no toilet paper there. They soon complain if the chapel's cold.
I'm sure the controversy is going to roll on.
Yeah.
And
so it's just well, I mean, the controversy is there, isn't it, with his Judas Iscariot saying all this money could have been used for the poor. But I think it really is a question of balance. And on that occasion, you have Mary coming in, And it's
Okay.
just this radical extravagance, isn't it, that she just has to show her love for the Lord, and it
Yeah.
doesn't really matter. And, you know, we have to have moments like that. I mean, Christmas is a moment like that where people let go and they really, I know they should do it all the year round, but at least, you know, there's that feeling of, you know, there's a glory of it, that momentous glory that we should all share in, and we should value it.
Okay. There'll be different ideas, different opinions. The cost of maintaining rural parish churches with their steeples and towers is and disproportionate to the numbers that worship there is an issue. But anyway, let's leave it there. Do we say welcome to the cat? It's a bit early tonight. It usually turns up halfway through.
She came up here.
And
She was on August lap.
say good evening to Marie anyway, who's joined us anyway.
Yes.
So let's just go to the last bit of that passage. So we're in chapter 12, okay, and verse 9. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came. Okay, he's in the house where he's been anointed by Mary and having a kind of thank you celebratory meal. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So it's very interesting. He's not that far away from Jerusalem itself. It's just a short journey, and they possibly that's where they were. They turned up for the Passover, and so there's quite a lot of people, but they're coming because they want to see this man who had died and had risen again, not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. What sort of impact does our testimony have? His testimony obviously had an enormous impact. And then John continues with the words, so the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. So not only is Jesus being looked for to be killed and got rid of, but Lazarus, who loves Jesus, is a threat as well. All the time he's alive and his testimony is running. He's a threat to the religious institutions of his day. For on account of him, on account of Lazarus, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. And I noticed the phrasing that John uses. Two things happening there. Verse 11, going over to Jesus and believing in Jesus. And I've looked back to see if there was anything in the Greek that might cast any light on exactly what was meant by this, and I can't find anything of help at all. But you just want to ponder that, and you may want to share some thoughts about it. It's very sad, isn't it, that the chief priests are reacting against this. They're negative towards Jesus. So the religious leaders of his day were very anti-Jesus. That's sad. But many Jews were going over to Jesus. What do you think that meant?
They were believing on Jesus, so they went away, and then it says in my Bible, and then they went. It says by reason of many of the Jews, they went away, and they believed on Jesus.
In the New Living Translation, verse 11, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Changing sides.
I think the Greek, when I looked at the Greek word that's translated going over in the NIV and the Authorized Version, it was a verb that implied leaving. So they were losing support to Jesus. Any other comments or questions?
Well, that's why they felt threatened. That's
Sorry,
the whole
Bob?
point. That's why they felt threatened,
Yes.
because there was a conscious move away from the orthodoxy to the belief in Jesus Christ.
Yes.
So obviously that that's not acceptable to them.
The phrase "believing in him" is interesting. But believing in him, I find it very, very difficult to exactly what is meant by believing in Jesus. Were they believing that he was the Messiah? Was that, or were they believing he was a teacher they could trust? We don't know, but they were moving away from the Pharisees. The Pharisees and Sadducees were losing their authority, and people were finding Jesus was more popular. But believing in him. Now, it's really relevant because in this passage, after John has told us the story of the raising of Lazarus, he tells us about how different sort of groups and individuals respond and react. And we're going to read more about that as we go on this evening, about how people responded to the person of Jesus, what he said and what he did. But believing in him, the Greek word is a word that means to believe. It's very simply just saying means what it means. It means to believe.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure exactly. You know, you could believe in Jesus, but that's not the same really as being committed to following him and being like him.
They believe what he said, haven't they? And what's happened. They believe that.
Yeah, they must have been believing he was somebody pretty special because he raised the dead.
Yeah.
So that was a key thing, I think. Right, shall we move on to the next day? Okay, so the next day is where exciting things start to happen in Jerusalem. So would somebody like to read through from verse 12 to verse 19, 12 to 19 in any version, and then if it's not the same in yours, please feel free to raise a question about it.
The next day, the great crowd that had come from the feast heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat upon it, as it is written, "Do not be afraid, O daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt." At first his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him, and they had done these things to him. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb, had raised him from the dead, continued to spread the word, and many people, because they had heard that he had given this miraculous sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him."
Okay, so we need to sort of try to put ourselves into the situation, imagine how we would have responded in that situation. For 400 years, they've been waiting for the Messiah to come, 400 years since the last bit of the Old Testament was written. And so now they're got this anticipation, and 33 years into the life of Jesus, they're proclaiming him King of Israel. And of course, before then, people wanted to make him king. So any comments or questions? Anybody like to remind us what Hosanna means? That would be quite useful if somebody wants to do that. And if we've got any comments about the passages of scripture that Jesus was fulfilling, do feel free to mention those. Or on anything in the passage up to verse 19 that struck you. Don't have to do it in any particular order.
Well, Hosanna means save.
Say again, John, please.
Hosanna means save.
Yes. Yeah, we often use it as a word meaning praise, but that doesn't mean that. It was save. They were anticipating that the Messiah was there to save the people of Israel, the people of God.
I was thinking about Hosanna, and the way it was used and the way it was said was an indication or an expression of people's expectation or appreciation of the grandeur of someone. And in that sense, although it was a prayer to save us or deliver us, it was also a form of recognition which could almost be called a type of praise or honor.
Okay, I'm with you on that. That's fine.
Do you think, Barry? Can you hear me?
Yes, Clive, carry on.
Do you think were the Pharisees and that were really expecting the Messiah, or were they going through the motions of expecting the Messiah? I think often today we get in a rut of going round and round and round, and the expectation of the Messiah, of God coming and saving his people, gets lost in the round of singing hymns and going through the motions. Do you think they were in the same position?
Yeah, I'm sure that they had taught that the Messiah was coming. I would have anticipated they would have done that, and so in a sense, and they were hyper biblical, weren't they? In what they did, so no shortage of preaching and teaching. So I'm sure there was that they were as much, but of course, the Jesus who had turned up wasn't quite what they expected, and he was sometimes quite critical of them, which certainly wasn't correct, was it? Can't criticize us; we're perfect. So, so the problem was the person of Jesus rather than the concept of the Messiah.
I think it will be hard not to divorce it from the nationalist yearnings of the people of that time. That here comes the Messiah in the Jewish mindset, in the Jewish scriptures, is coming to restore Israel to its rightful place in the world.
Yes.
And here is the King who is coming. So, I mean, even if you weren't totally convinced, say you were facing the crowd and you weren't totally convinced, the sentiment of that feeling, the sentiment of that yearning would be intoxicating. And we can imagine it won't be hundreds of people; it will be thousands of people. The waving of the palm of the palm branches is also it's a nationalist thing to do. And here comes our liberator. We want this change, and it is reflected in the 118th Psalm, verse 25. This Hosanna thing is there, and the whole Psalm really does, reflect that
Excuse me.
that expected prophecy. So it's a dangerous situation for the people for the Sadducees who were collaborating with the Romans, because what you're actually doing, you're actually, you're seeing what appears to be the beginning of an insurrection,
Absolutely,
and a revolutionary movement.
Absolutely,
and you can't separate the politics from the religion.
No, absolutely. It's important to remember it was an occupied country. There were Roman soldiers on the streets. Fiona, need to unmute yourself, Fiona.
You were asking about which prophecy he was fulfilling, and it was Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9.
Yes.
And if you just read that verse, it says he's coming on a donkey and on a colt. If you read the bits before and the bits after it in Zechariah, it's talking about the judgment on Israel's enemies and about how he's going to come, he's going to rule the people and set prisoners free and rule the whole area.
Yeah.
And bring peace to the world.
Yeah, you're
so
saying,
it's a kind of very revolutionary setting.
Saying much the same as
the verse came from.
As Bob. The sense of it being a political uprising.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, difficult days. Just to remind you that Caiaphas was put in place. His father Annas was removed as high priest, and Caiaphas was put in his place by the Roman authorities. So it was a political appointment, really. It was a religious function, but a political appointment.
Hmm.
So this is really as much as anything, it's a political uprising, isn't it? You know, the riot on the streets, everybody waving palm branches and cheering and shouting and saying, I mean, how controversial was to say, blessed is the King of Israel. Do you find you have to say blessed? If you're brought up in a church where everybody says blessed instead of blessed, it's very difficult to stop saying blessed.
Blessed, yes.
It doesn't
right,
say blessed, it says blessed.
Mm.
Blessed is the King of Israel. Wow, that was red rag to a bull, wasn't it?
Mm.
I find 16 interesting because it said at first his disciples did not understand all this. They only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that they had done these things to him. So they've realized afterwards that the promises have come.
Chrissy, thank you for that. It's another one of the editor's notes. So it's a commentary.
It's in the Bible.
But he breaks into the scene, and writing sometime later, quite a long time later, John adds, at first his disciples did not understand all this. His disciples didn't understand it, not just the crowd. His disciples did not understand it. Only after Jesus was glorified, an interesting word that's used there, did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him. So different people have different ideas as to exactly when John wrote this, but most think he was about 90 years old or something, and he's like an old man. So it was quite a long time later he's writing and reflecting on the thing. But it's interesting to note that they didn't understand. It's all going on around them. I mean, the whole thing had been taken over by the crowd, and the disciples might have been a bit nonplussed, didn't know why they'd gone looking for a donkey anyway. So they're a bit nonplussed over the whole thing, and not understanding why it's going on. Why is their master doing this? No, why is he running such a risk of inflaming the Pharisees and inflaming the Romans? Is that right? Anybody want to comment?
Yeah, Bob does.
This lovely bit in the Gospel of Luke. I'm not going to make it. It just says it, and it just sums it up for me. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And he answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out."
Yeah, just give us the Bible reference, please.
It's Luke, chapter I think it's chapter 9, and it's
Luke chapter 9. Okay.
Yeah, 30.
Okay.
But it's verse 39. 30.
Okay. Thank you. I don't mind if you don't quote the verse. It makes people read a lot more to find it. I'm going to go back to Fiona, who's raised her hand. Mute.
It's also, in a way, the first time Jesus has really done something in a very open, public way. Whereas before, when he's been teaching or anything, it's been in the temple or in someone's house. This is kind of like him sticking his head above the parapet, doing it in public at the time when his life is threatened.
Yeah, a few days before he'd retreated and gone to Ephraim. So very much suddenly change of agenda for Jesus. And we've got a cat and a dog. This is really good. Interesting meeting. Right, okay. Anybody listening to the sound recording will wonder what we're talking about. Right, okay. So
lovely.
We have a few more comments. Was I missing anybody?
I was just thinking about John's editorial note when he says the disciples didn't understand. In a way, he's saying, including me.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, the word glorified, I said that was interesting. The issue was this referring to his resurrection, possibly after he'd been raised from the dead, that was the occasion. But later on, he also talks about when he's lifted up. So that sort of comes into it a bit as well. Right. Okay. So let's just look at the last bit of it all. Now we've got two crowds mentioned here. So look at verse 12. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way, and they took palm branches, went out to meet him. So you can imagine these being possibly mostly people from Galilee who would have known something about the miracles and things he'd done and taught. And they've heard he's on his way, and they're living in this expectation of the Messiah coming. So they've gone out to meet him. So the great crowd that's referred to in verse 12 are people who've come from the countryside into Jerusalem to worship. Okay. Later on, verse 17, we have a different crowd. Okay. The crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead. These people were going around spreading the word. They were telling people all over the place, couldn't stop telling people about the miracle that they'd seen. Somebody who was dead has been raised from the dead. Bear in mind the climate conditions, and that he'd been in the tomb for 4 days and was expected to stink. So it's an amazing, absolutely amazing miracle. So they're going around spreading the word. Those that had seen it spread the word. And many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, that's John giving indication to his messianic sign, 7 signs. This was the final one, the raising of Lazarus, went out to meet him. The first one, you remember, was turning water into wine. So the Pharisees said one to another, "See, this is getting us nowhere." You can hear their voice, can't you? "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look, the whole world's gone after him." Quite stirring situation. Any final comments before we read on? Okay, then let's read on. Let's work out what we've got to do. The next section in my Bible goes through as far as verse 35. So we're going from 20. I think what we got to really read. I think we've got to read it all. Let's read through to verse 36, please. So from verse 20 to 36, and then we'll come back and ask questions.
Some Greeks who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration paid a visit to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. They said, "Sir, we want to meet Jesus." Philip told Andrew about it, and they went together to ask Jesus. Jesus replied, "Now the time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. Those who love their life in this world will lose it. Those who care nothing for their life in this world will keep it for eternity. Anyone who wants to be my disciple must follow me, because my servants must be where I am, and the Father will honor anyone who serves me. Now my soul is deeply troubled. Should I pray, 'Father, save me from this hour'? But this is the very reason I came. Father, bring glory to your name." Then a voice spoke from heaven, saying, "I have already brought glory to my name, and I will do so again." When the crowd heard the voice, some thought it was thunder, while others declared an angel had spoken to him. Then Jesus told them, "The voice was for your benefit, not mine. The time for judging this world has come, when Satan, the ruler of this world, will be cast out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself. He said this to indicate how he was going to die. The crowd responded, "We understood from Scripture that the Messiah would live forever. How can you say the Son of Man will die? Just who is this Son of Man anyway?" Jesus replied, "My light will shine for you just a little longer. Walk in the light while you can, so the darkness will not overtake you. Those who walk in the darkness cannot see where they're going. Put your trust in the light while there is still time, then you will become children of the light." After saying these things, Jesus went away and was hidden from them.
Thank you, Carol. Very, 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 very interesting. It's obviously different from the version that I'm looking at, but nothing varied significantly. It was all fine. We start off with this incident involving certain Greeks who'd come to worship at the festival, and they come along and talk to one of the disciples, and he passes the news on to two other disciples, or to one other, and he probably passed on to another. So we don't know that Jesus ever really responded. It says, verse 23 starts, Jesus replied, but whether that was just a reply to the disciples, or whether it was a reply to the Greeks, we don't know. But in the main, we don't seem to know what he had to say to the Greeks. Does anybody want to comment about the Greeks who were there and what they were seeking, and if you need to, who they came to? It's a lovely verse, isn't it? You know, it's something that's jumped out at me since my childhood, about the Greeks coming saying, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." I wonder if that inspired the song, "We want to see Jesus lifted high." Fiona.
It's a bit like they were asking permission to see Jesus. Like they didn't feel worthy enough to just go by themselves.
Yeah, perhaps they didn't feel unworthy. I don't know, but certainly they're looking for an access, aren't they? They're wanting some face-to-face meeting with Jesus. They want to take it a stage further beyond the crowd. No other comments?
I think it's a sign that things are changing, that Jesus is coming, and God is not just for Jews, it's for everyone. And but that's going to mean sacrifice. So then he goes on to about the fact that the Son of Man will be lifted up.
Yes.
And be glorified by that, but that's near the end.
Thank you, David.
And I think it's his willingness to obey God for what goes against what the common sense would have said, that means that God is glorified in what he does.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I particularly like your comment about the changing position. The emphasis is Jesus, the Saviour of the world, and it's interesting. I mean, as far as John's concerned, in writing this account, he's made note that these are Greeks. Now, by saying Greeks, they may have been people from Greece, or they may have just been people that were Greek in culture. There were two dominant cultures of the day. The Greek culture was still prevalent, but also, of course, the Roman culture. So in a sense, there are three, because we're looking at a situation that surrounds the Jewish people. So the Jews had a culture as well. So we've got a Jewish culture, a Greek culture, and a Roman culture. It's quite a challenging mix in which Jesus operated and his first disciples operated. The cultural context, it's quite important to think about that. So they come to Philip. Why Philip? I haven't got the faintest idea. He was a Galilean. He comes from Bethsaida, and they brought their request to him. But I wondered whether what was in their minds. Their words are, "We would like to see Jesus." That's their words. What do you think is in their mind?
I think they're looking for a revelation of who Christ was. I mean, I suppose in sort of contemporary terms, you could say they were spiritual seekers. they've heard of the Christ, and they're looking. Although they are Greeks, they are looking to be saved, and I think the next sentence that follows on has to be taken in context, because really Jesus is saying what the price is.
Yes.
What the
Okay.
price is, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. No, that's quite useful. I think for me, I'm just wondering exactly why do they want to see Jesus? I don't think they have the same anticipation and expectation as the Jews, and John has made a distinction. These are Greeks, so they would have been interested. They would have been interested in philosophical issues. So this man's an important teacher. Things are going on. He's a significant character of their day. And I sometimes think that there are some people who just want to see Jesus, but don't necessarily want to listen to him. Fiona again?
Also, they would have been different from most Greeks, because it said they came to worship at the festival. So instead of believing in all the different gods that the Greeks normally did, they must have thought the Jewish people had something important, and then Jesus was important as well.
Right, thank you. It's a good point, very good point, that they've come to worship at the festival. They've not just turned up for the party. They've come to worship.
The God-fearers, aren't they, really? Is that what you're saying, Fiona?
Yeah. They thought that the Jewish people had a God who was worth worshipping instead of everybody else that they could have worshipped.
Yeah, okay. So it's very interesting to think about the impact in our day. Who is it that we're impacting? Who's sitting up taking notice, wanting to see Jesus? Ambrose.
This is a secondary thing, perhaps. In verse 21 and 22, they came to Philip, and Philip went to Andrew, and then they together went to Jesus. So they were checking up with each other, as it were. And sometimes maybe it's good for us as Christians to check with other people, or whatever. I'm not sure what the lesson is, but there's something there.
Right. Then we have this reply of Jesus where he says about the Son of Man to be glorified. It's now's the time, he's saying, that the Son of Man is to be glorified. And then he does this sort of allegory or parable type thing where he talks about a grain of wheat falling into the ground and dying and then producing many seeds. And he talks about loving life and losing it, or hating life and gaining it, and about those who follow him. That's the price that they're going to follow him. So, and he talks about serving him as well, which is another interesting word. If we go on to verse 27, we have a situation where Jesus is speaking still, but seems to have turned the topic slightly. He says, now my soul is troubled, and the sort of sense of that is stirred up. I'm disturbed, like the troubled water where Jesus healed the man at the pool of Bethsaida. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Then he says, Father, glorify your name. So just look at the whole of that. His soul is troubled. He says, now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. I'm feeling a bit anxious about it. Save me from this hour. It's all beginning to happen and it's on top of me. No, it was for this very reason I came. I can't ask you to save me. Instead, I ask that you glorify your name. That's when a voice is heard coming from heaven that people hear on this occasion. Don't quite hear what it is. Some people think it was thunder. Others think it was the words of an angel. But what the voice said was, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. Jesus says, the voice was for your benefit, not mine. I didn't need to get affirmation from my Father. You needed to hear that.
I don't understand that, because the people thought it was thunder, and it implies they didn't understand that it was actually words. So I don't understand why Jesus said that the voice was for their benefit.
I've got a suggestion, but it can only be a suggestion because the Bible doesn't make it clear. My suggestion is that the disciples heard it.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can't see why it was for the benefit of the crowd. I think it was for the benefit of the disciples. Fiona wants to come back.
Well, some of them heard it as thunder, but some of them heard it as words. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said it was an angel.
Yes, they interpreted it as speech, didn't they? An angel spoke to him.
Yes.
It reminds me of his baptism.
Yes. Yeah.
And the voice
That's
of
when
God
his,
speaking there, and not everybody heard what was being
No.
said, but only Jesus and John understood what was being said. And I think it's sort of the noise was an affirmation that he was who he claimed to be, and what he was going to do was God's will. And I think this is almost a pre-Gethsemane moment that he's had all this popularity, all this conflict, made loads of friends, and then suddenly he's going to be on his own, on a cross, in pain, watched only by a few people, including his mother, and it must be so hard to face. Yet he knows he has to go through it, and that for me challenges me, because there are times when I think I just don't want to do this. I don't want to do this, but then I think, well, I feel God's calling me to do this, so I better get on and do it and stop moaning.
Thank you, David. And good to be reminded of the incident at the baptism of Jesus when a similar voice was heard as well, affirming who he is, that he was the Son of God in whom he was well pleased. He goes on to say, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world, that's the devil, now the prince of this world will be driven out. And he says, and I, when I am lifted up. Now that could mean exalted, it could mean glorified, or it could have been implying quite clearly the crucifixion. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And that's very interesting. I will draw all people to myself. That's quite intriguing. Are we living through those days? Is that what we're seeing as people put their trust in Jesus? Is that him drawing people to himself? He said, I will draw all people. We haven't seen all people drawn to him. And certainly in his own day, there were others who rejected him. And he says this to show the kind of death he was going to die. So that's a little bit of comment again by the author. Anybody want to comment?
Could I say, on this verse 24, it says, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for your purpose to glorify your name. And I think what Jesus is facing really speaks to the human condition, because we're all going to face that hour, aren't we? We're all going to die at some point, and we don't want to die. We want to live. We want to live as long as we possibly can. Most people do anyway. And so the Christian that can die in faith, that can accept God's will and accept it, peacefully and with anticipation, is really giving glory to God. Every person that does that is giving glory to God by virtue of their example. And in a way, Jesus is showing us how to die, how to accept that this life we have is temporary, and that what will be, and all of it is in the hands of God, and that our acceptance of that, our acceptance of God's will, is given is that glory, isn't it? You know.
Yes, there is, isn't it interesting? There is a sense in which all of us. I mean, I saw my father die. He was in excruciating pain in hospital. In fact, reminded of it by recent things that have been going on in the news. My father had been seriously ill for some time, and he was eventually taken to hospital and was not given much help and support while he was in hospital, although he obviously were giving him painkillers. But he asked me to pray for him and commit him to the Lord, which I did. I cried over him as I prayed, so I baptized him in my tears. But I thank God for all that he had done in his life and all his experience of Jesus in his life, and just commended him to the Lord, which is what he wanted me to do. And then I withdrew, and the nurse in charge, the sister, ward sister, turned to the doctor and said, "Doctor, he's in a lot of pain. Can I increase his medication?" And she didn't need to spell it out, but I knew that she was referring to giving him a higher dose of morphine, and I knew that giving him a higher dose of morphine would shorten his remaining life. And I didn't make any objection to that. I didn't have to think about it. I just wanted him to be free from pain in that moment. We had been already told that he only had at the most hours to live, perhaps only minutes. So he was right at the end of his life. But one of his last thoughts was to talk to God. He wanted to finish with a conversation to God. And there was something glorifying of God in the way that my dad chose to die, which is wonderful. On the other hand, there is the sense in which, while we might not be martyred, and the issue of how well we might die is yet to be proved, there is the issue of whether we've died already. Have we already died to self? Have we died to sin and self? Do we count ourselves as dead bodies, that doesn't respond to the allures of this world because we're dead to this world? That's the important thing. And elsewhere in the Gospels, of course, it gets expounded in that way, which is important. And if we hold on to the life that we live for pleasure and enjoyment of this world, then we lose our lives. But if we're prepared to sacrifice to follow Jesus, we gain life that is forever. Any further comment or questions?
Just a comment, if I may.
Ambrose.
In addition to all these lovely thoughts we've had, in verse 27 and the beginning of 28, when he says, "My soul is troubled,"
yeah,
I was just thinking about Jesus being the Son of Man and the Son of God. It sounds quite obvious, but there are different ways, weren't there, which would impact him. The physical suffering, but then the suffering of taking sin, the one who knew no sin. So no wonder he felt troubled.
Yeah, and the picture. I've known moments of deep anxiety when in the pit of my stomach I'm feeling, really disturbed. And I kind of get that sense. But it is the wonder of our Saviour is that he was very God and very man. God stepped into this world to sacrifice himself for you and for me. So that's the amazing thing. But in order to do that, he had to become very human, and therefore he suffered human extremities as well. We see that in the Garden of Gethsemane, but we're beginning to see it here, aren't we? Okay, right. We've time to wrap it up quite nicely, I think. We've got a controversy that develops, okay? The crowd heard him talk about being lifted up, and he was saying that to show the kind of death he was going to die, says John. Now, the crowd spoke up. We've heard from the law, that's the law of Moses. We've heard from, or the books of Moses, to be, the first 5 books. We've heard from the law that Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who's this Son of Man? So it's nice to know there were controversies in those days and difficulties in squaring circles theologically in those days, as there are in our day as well. So that they don't understand, can't quite understand who this Son of Man is that Jesus is talking about. Is he talking about himself or somebody else? They're a bit lost here. So Jesus says, you are going to have the light. I liked in Carol's version, it said my light. In mine, it just says you're going to have the light just a little while longer. Makes sense for it to be Jesus saying my light, of course. While you have the light, before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they're going. Believe in the light while you have the light. That's believe in me while you have the light, so that you may become children of light. And then it says, when he finished speaking, he left and he hid himself. So just a few opportunity to reflect on that, and any questions or comments about what Jesus was saying about walking in the light. We know that John picks up that theme in his first chapter in the Gospel. In him was light, and the light was the life of the world. Light came in and darkness could not overcome it, or possibly comprehend it.
I mean, it's a massive text, isn't it? I mean, Jesus is talking about being lifted up, but he also refers to the bronze snake that was lifted up in the wilderness to the children of Israel, and that Jesus lifted up.
Yeah, I can't remember whether we've had in John's Gospel the reference back to the incident in the wilderness, but certainly there is that parallel passage anyway.
Yeah, but it's important, isn't it? Because
absolutely,
when they look at the bronze snake,
yeah, absolutely,
they see the thing that's biting them. And when the Lord Jesus Christ is lifted up in the same way, that we see our sin, that He is carrying our sin, and that's a parallel, isn't it? You know.
Yeah, when I was in Sunday school, and we used to sing various songs and hymns, and have the story of Jesus and his crucifixion, I always had in my mind standing at the foot of the cross and looking up and seeing Jesus on the cross dying, and hearing his words of love about his mother and his love for the soldiers, saying, forgive them, they know not why they do. And it was a real experience for me, standing looking up at the cross.
Mm.
No other comments about light and darkness?
Yeah, well, Jesus is the light of the world, and he's saying, as long as we walk in the light, which he is in the light, then we won't stumble and we won't walk in darkness, meaning to say that we won't go back in the flesh, because if we're walking with Jesus in the light, we're actually walking in the spirit.
Yes.
And it's only when we take our eyes off the Lord and we start to do what we want to do. And in a way, really, we're supposed to die to self anyway. This is what we're learning day by day.
Yeah.
We're not perfect yet, but we're learning. We're learning day by day. The Lord convicts us about things. He shows us things as we're going along.
Yes. And
he's trying to get things out of my life. Obviously, he does something to me every week, I think.
Yes. Sometimes it takes longer to winkle things out of our lives. We used to have winkles on the Hastings seafront, and which were like little snails, and we used to have a pin, and we had to try and dig the winkle out of its shell. So winkling out things that ought not to be in our lives is quite a challenge, really. So the issue of having light is really important. Remember also, Jesus said, you are the light of the world, because he says, believe in the light and you may become children of light. So he wants our lives to illuminate the area and the community in which we live. We should be bringing the light of God, reflecting that. It's not so much reflecting it, it's having the spiritual energy of the light in us that we then become light.
I think it's interesting that the crowd interpret the lifting up as being as death, don't they?
Yes. Yeah.
And so they don't have any question about the meaning of the lifting up.
No.
In this passage. But what Jesus then says doesn't directly answer their question, does it? It gives us the question to juggle with and to say, well, why did he give that particular answer?
Yeah.
He didn't say, well, I'm talking about me, or your expectations are not right. He didn't say any of those things which we would have done.
I asked the question when we began this section, what did we think that the Greeks were doing? What were they after? Did they just want to meet somebody who's important and get his autograph? Or is it really they were wanting to hear what he had to say and discover what they could find and gain from him? We don't know. We just have a question and we get no clear answer. But what we do get is the words that we've been talking through ourselves about things that Jesus was going to be doing. So that's how he responded to the question or the issue of we will see Jesus. We want to see Jesus. And I think that there are lots of people who are interested in the philosophy of Christianity, but what people need to know is about the cross. They need to understand the cross. It's the cross that's the most important thing. And our solution, if people are wanting to know all sorts of things, the answer comes back to the cross again and again.
I was interested in Philip, and I looked back at the first sort of message, the first
reference.
About, the next day, it's in chapter 1. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Come with me." Philip was from Bethsaida. Again, that's his origins are mentioned.
Yes.
Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the book of the law." And then Nathanael says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip says, "Come and see." And he seems to have this sort of ministry of saying, "Come and see." And so they say, "Sir, we want to see Jesus." So Philip takes them with Andrew, "Come and see." And then we see him in Acts going out into the desert and opening the eyes of the Ethiopian eunuch. And he seems to be enabling people to come and see Jesus. I thought it was interesting.
It's a nice sermon suggestion from you, John. The bit that you missed out was Philip, as you've emphasized, came from Bethsaida, and that's where the area where Jesus fed the 5,000, and Jesus asked Philip, "Where can we go that we can buy food for these people?"
Yes.
Well, he's the local lad. He would have known if there was a shop open at that time of night, which it wasn't. But interesting, yeah. We don't know a huge amount, but it's lovely to have these references brought back to our minds. Time has gone. And thank you all for contributions. Anybody feeling that they've got a question that hasn't been addressed?
Harry, can I just say, I know we're running out of time, but I just really feel here at verse 32, where Jesus says, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself." And there, the Christ there on the cross, that is the glory, isn't it? That's what draws people. It's what really sets the Christian faith apart from every other. Well, there are no other faiths, but from every other religion in the world. I'll draw all people when I'm on the there. It's just so powerful, I think. That.
Yeah, my commitment, my total commitment to the Lord came about hearing a sermon on Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And it was an Easter Saturday, because Easter doesn't take place until Sunday. So but that was mind-blowing to me. That was, again, a great moment at the foot of the cross. And he sang, "When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died." And the sense of God's presence was almost scary. And I said to him, I can't sing the last verse of this hymn unless you enable me to mean it. If you can make me mean it, I'll sing it. But you've got to make me mean it, because I won't sing it if I don't mean it. And God just overwhelmed me, and I sang that last verse at the top of my voice. Never sung louder than I sang that night.